really grateful to everyone for joining us and excited to start this conversation. So I'm going to try to not geek out too much here, but I am so excited to be chatting with Sisi Wei, editor-in-chief of The Markup. The Markup is a nonprofit investigative newsroom that challenges technology to serve the public good. We'll dig into that a little bit. Before joining The Markup, Sisi was co-executive director of Open News. She also served as assistant managing editor at ProPublica from 2018 to 2020, where she managed a large interdisciplinary investigations across newsrooms, one of which won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2020. Sisi also serves on the board of the News Revenue Hub and the Open Notebook. She is so cool. I'm going to try to be cool. Really excited for this conversation. Sisi, thank you so much for joining us here. And before we get started here, I was doing a little bit of research, and I wanted to spend a minute here. Let's answer the question. How you feeling? How you feeling?
Oh, how am I feeling? What a moment in time it is. I'm really excited to be here, by the way. Thank you for doing this, B, and everyone at Aspen. I feel like, December is the time of year in journalism where we publish endlessly, more so than any other time of the year. And, you know, I think we are here to talk about AI, which will continue to have great impact on society. And simultaneously with that, the world is going through a lot right now. We have two active wars going on, and it seems like every day there's sort of a new twist in what people are really concerned about because there's a lot of concerning things out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an overwhelming time in so many respects. And I feel like that in particular means that journalism and places we can go for information are only the more valuable and the more powerful. And I feel like your role in particular, as someone who acts as an editor, is really interesting because you've been a leader not just in helping the public to understand things, but also as an editor, you and through a lot of the work in your career, you've done a lot of work in helping journalists to understand the chaotic and confusing world that we live in, and particularly through the lens of technology. So I wonder if you could open us out here talking a little bit, like Eleanor asked in our previous panel, what are some of the people that you find yourself talking to? What are the categories of folks that you find yourself talking to? And what are your recommendations to folks as they're trying to wrap their heads around AI?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I think there's sort of two elements to this. As a journalist, we're often trying to understand exactly to the most granular detail possible how something works. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more later in terms of like, how do we communicate about AI? Because it's also important to really understand it at a deeper level. But in terms of the people that I'm talking to, or even let's just broaden that out to the types of people that the markup is talking to when we do all of our stories, right? We have a mix of people who are always the active users of whatever technology we're reporting on, or whatever algorithm or AI that we are writing about. And then also the people who are directly impacted by it. In a lot of our work, sometimes people, how do I phrase this? A really common experience, regardless if it's about AI or any other kind of tech, is that when it impacts a community, they often can feel the effects and know it's happening, but they don't know that it's happening literally as a result of a specific technology or someone using that technology, right? So when we talk to them, we often end up breaking the news to them exactly why this feeling or this consequence that they already know might be happening. And then once they know, we follow up after the fact as well. And it is sort of this cycle of knowing that communities sort of know when things are going on, even if they don't know literally how it came to be, or if they only know some of the elements, right? But they don't know the specific tech element. If we can add to that knowledge, that's also one of the things where like communicating can actually equip people to take more action, to have more agency. Um, But on the second part of your question, right, where can people go if they're just trying to wrap their heads around AI? I think the panelists gave great answers. So I will give a very, very chill answer, which is if you're like AI is overwhelming, I don't know what to do, which a lot of people feel that way, and you kind of want to just get some like fun examples, I actually highly recommend that you go to TikTok and search for like AI. And the amazing thing about TikTok is that the videos are going to be like 10 seconds or 30 seconds long. And they're highly focused on actually showing you how to do things. Like you'll get really funny uses, which I think is really casual and inviting to people. But then you'll get some serious work uses as well. And through that, you might actually be able to connect to it in a way that doesn't feel so high stakes.
Great call out. And yeah, absolutely. I think there's such a world of possibilities, and even knowing where to go within that world of possibilities can feel like a lot. So having specific examples like that is really great. What to look up, what terms to use. Love to see it. I'd love to dig in a little bit more though, the markup speaks to an audience of people, but you, Sisi Wei, speak to an audience of people as an editor. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about like how you approach conversations with other journalists about this topic these days.
Yeah. With other journalists, this is something that I've been trying to figure out for maybe almost a year now as well, which is that we work with local journalists all the time and also other national journalists. And one of the things I've been noticing is that similar to what I said about communities, journalists know when there's a problem. And they sometimes know, like, I just have to investigate this person, this organization, this process, and then I'll be able to get to the heart of the problem. But sometimes there's a technology barrier where they're like, oh, if only I could get access to every example of this in the city, right? Like every parking ticket in the city and the reason why, then maybe I could do more with it. And there have been moments in which people have come to us at the Markup being like, can we get some collaborative help to help us sort of unlock information? And a lot of it is around algorithms in some way, which to me is like the original gem of where AI is coming from, right? There's algorithms in anything that has to do with AI. And what I often say to people is one, that you're not alone, right? If you're confused about it, if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know how to use it in your work as a journalist, you're not alone. Just everyone in every industry is trying to figure it out. And then the other thing is that we did this survey with a lot of local partners that we're interested in, asking them if we could help you cover AI better, right? Tell us more about what your needs are. And there was one question where we asked people to just be really honest. And we gave them some pretty sassy, opinionated choices where they could pick everything that resonated with them. And literally the most popular survey answer to one of our questions, where people felt like figuring out how our newsroom will cover AI feels important, but too hard to tackle. That was the most popular survey answer, right? And that is something that resonates with me a lot because a lot of my work previous to being an editor was teaching journalists how to code, right? Because that opens tons of doors for what you can do. But I'll say one second thing, a piece of advice I give to journalists is that no matter what you cover, also don't rule out AI's relevance, right? Some people are like, oh, I cover food, I cover arts, I cover, whatever topic, and they don't think AI, is something that they have to pay attention to. But actually, I think it's going to permeate, right? It has been permeating already into everything. And I promise that it will become relevant. And so the more that you at least play with it now, the better it will allow you to be able to report on it when you really, really have direct interaction with it. Um, and then I do have one last thing, and I think this goes for everyone, which is I give this advice to new reporters who are covering technology, but it applies to journalists, it applies to everyday people, right? And it's that if you are writing about AI or trying to understand it and you just don't understand how something works, you most likely will end up asking questions of someone who you think does understand how it works, right? So in journalism, we do this through interviews, but anyone can do this with someone that they have access to or want to call up. And if the person explaining the technology to you says something that you can't understand, ask them to explain it another way. Never be intimidated by the technology, because if someone can't explain it to you in a way that you get, either they're not great at explaining the topic, which valid, we're not all great at explaining everything, or two, they don't actually fully understand it themselves and you're helping them realize that. But it is never number three, you individually don't have the capacity to understand it. That is never the case, right? So if you don't get it, just keep asking. And that's how you're actually really able to get at the root of how something works. Never doubt yourself and your capability in understanding.
Absolutely. Absolutely love that. And I think that, in the work that you do, you have had so many, throughout your career, so many resources for other journalists, so many resources for folks who are learning about coding, learning about a type of data reporting, and that kind of intellectual humility, but also a little bit of like, no, I deserve to be able to know this. Like I should be able to follow up. I think it's really powerful, and I think folks in the journalism field are famous for your questions. So really interesting to be on the other end of it, asking you questions here. And I'm actually curious. Sometimes it's helpful for folks to have specific examples, and I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit. But are there particular questions that you find to be really expansive, or are there questions that you wish more journalists would ask when talking to people about these technologies?
Yeah, I would say there's probably two buckets of questions. The first bucket gets into what I was just talking about, which is dig into how the algorithm or how the AI works. And what I mean by that is sometimes, and our profession is responsible for this too, where you read about something and it's AI or machine learning or algorithms because there's one sentence that says like, so and so organization used machine learning to do this, and then it just tells you about what they do, but not about the tech. And I would say never let that go. Always ask like, okay, but what does that mean? What do you actually use it for? How does that actually play into everything else you're saying this is doing? Is it because you have a database of people's faces and the technology is facial recognition? Do you have access to descriptions of a ton of famous art? And that's how your, like art gallery AI works. How exactly does it work? Because sometimes you'll discover, and the previous panel I think got at this as well, sometimes you'll discover something is actually not really AI. It's something else that you can actually very easily explain to other people, but because it's hidden behind this term that could mean anything, right? There's no clarity. And then a second category of question is really asking questions that lead to what is the impact of this AI, right? So right now, AI is emerging, right? And like every technology before it, it has absorbed all of mankind, humankind's problems, like racism, sexism, et cetera, because that is all the information it's had access to train on, right? And so, of course, theoretically, it can be used in a way to purposely show that bias. Like that is not surprising to me when any article like that comes out. It's not surprising to the public. But the key to make it really interesting is that that's only 50% of the story, right? The other half is trying to figure out, asking questions so you can narrow down who's actually using it that way versus theoretically to prove a point. And then also, if you figure out there are people using it that way or some way similar, what then is the consequence? Like what happens as a result of how they're using it? Are they using it to make decisions? And who is subject to those decisions, right? And so those two buckets, I think, are the main things when you want to know more about a specific AI or algorithm or any piece of tech, honestly, what I would ask.
Fantastic. Yeah, I feel like that point you made about the sort of obfuscation of using a big blanket term like AI is something that's really resonant, and it's not always nefarious, right? It can
Right.
be someone's own, unfamiliarity or ignorance where like they just use the bucket term to explain everything, but that level of specificity and digging in is so powerful. That being said, it is also the case that I fancy myself a metaphor smith of sorts. There is power in using metaphor, simile, analogies, other parts of speech that I won't be able to remember. Right. And in your work, you have used these tools, you've used games to communicate journalistically. You've used these tools. So I'm curious, when you're thinking about communicating about technology, AI in particular, but even technology more broadly, how do you kind of balance using, evocative descriptions that help people to place a mental model of something against the specificity and accuracy of what's actually going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, the solution I think is both extremely simple, but extremely complicated, which is you definitely use both, right? It's kind of like I'll draw a different parallel. I'll use a simile to explain our meta discussion about similes. In a lot of the journalism we do at the Markup, it's highly technical, right? We do a lot of data analysis, or we're trying to sort of look at an algorithm and then tell you how it does or doesn't work. And we can't write an article that only does that, right? We also have to say, explain to you a human being and introduce you to them and then show you like how this interacts with their actual life and why it matters. And it's the marriage of those two things that makes journalism really powerful, right? And so in the same vein, metaphors, similes, you should absolutely use them because it helps people really step into something they understand already. And then you can describe on the technical side sort of what things are actually different, right? What's important to point out that the simile or metaphor doesn't actually cover or would make you think, right? So like basically like don't be afraid of simplifying things as long as you give people an understanding that that's not the entire story, but it can be used to do what? It can be used to help you understand how AI works. It can be used to, explain that part of it too.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I don't want to give up on those metaphors. So it's comforting to hear from someone as expert as yourself that it's okay. It's okay to use those language as long as we make sure that we also ground people in the realities. I'm curious if you've ever encountered a situation where there was a miscommunication about technology, or a place where you've noticed a common place of misunderstanding, and if you can share a little bit about kind of how do you navigate, when you're kind of detective work, digging into these tools and understanding what's actually going on behind the scenes. Can you share with us a little bit about, what can go wrong, but also how we can recover from it?
Yeah, it's so funny, right? So people in all sorts of industries obfuscate what they really mean for good and bad reasons all the time. We actually did a piece just a couple months ago about if you're reading privacy policies nowadays, what phrases mean secretly something else and how to decode that. So if you're interested in privacy policies, you can totally check that out. But what I will say about like the biggest maybe misnomer is to me, and I say this all the time, which is artificial intelligence, right? What AI stands for. Artificial intelligence is not artificially intelligent. Instead, to me, it's actually just really good branding. So if you think about what the panel said before me as well, right? It's like artificial intelligence sort of means a lot of things in a literal way. But if we just think about it as the phrase itself, it really communicates sentience, right? And but there is actually no sentience yet. But that implication sort of makes people sort of go down this doomsday sort of vibe of thinking, right? And if you think about it, there's another term we've thrown around, both in the panel and myself, that was pretty popular right before artificial intelligence became the popular phrase, which is machine learning, right? And if you think about the words machine learning and then artificial intelligence, they're basically the same words, right? They're just each part of the phrases is a synonym for the other part, artificial and machine learning and intelligent. And what I would say is that when it comes to AI, I would kind of think of it as if it was a proper noun, like Kleenex instead of tissue. It's not a brand, obviously, but it is now a stand-in, right, for something bigger. And we can use it that way because that's just how people are literally using it. But that's also why the flip side of like, how do we get out of misnomers, right? Is that when you are talking about AI overall, I think you're welcome to use that. And then once you get into the practicalities, don't even use AI. Use words that explain literally what's happening, right? Like, so and so department uses a database with people's information and matches it to this in order to, identify someone, right? Just describe what's actually going on. And that comparison right there allows you to trigger in people's minds like, oh, they're talking about AI. That's a bucket of information that I have in my brain. And then here's what's literally happening about what I'm trying to communicate to you.
Yeah, I feel like you're I'm like, you're stealing my thunder here, Sisi, but I have been on a mission to just have AI stand for nothing. My comms director is not a big fan of this, but instead of writing artificial intelligence in parentheses AI and then using AI through the rest of a piece, I'm like, can we just call it AI? Like you were saying about like,
Yeah.
calling Kleenex tissue or tissues Kleenex, what if it just doesn't stand for anything? What if it's just a word and the word just happens to be AI? Like that could be okay. Because
Right.
yeah, I think it has taken on so much more meaning. And in that way, it is kind of it is I think even folks who, the old school AI people, the from like the 70s and the 80s, folks who are working in this space, I think there's some frustration of like, oh, people are using this to mean anything these days. But I actually see that as kind of liberating. Like people are using it to mean anything. So like let's use that as the bucket and then get specific about the thing instead of trying to like force people to only talk about AI in one particular way, because it's just cat's out of the bag there, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
I think society will take words wherever they want to. And if you fight against it, people just won't know what you mean.
yeah, there's definitely a duty. The folks on the last panel shared, meeting people where they are is so important and so powerful. And I think nowhere is that more the case than in communicating to broad audiences in the ways that journalists do. So I really appreciate that perspective. I wonder if we might be a little bit self-serving here and ask you with your great editorial expertise, if you might talk a little bit about something we wrote. We shared with folks these primers, these resources that we put together to introduce people to the topic of AI. I won't say to AI. And I'm curious if you might call out either something that you appreciate in those primers or something that you would change or add or evolve about the way that we are talking about AI.
Yeah, it's a great question and it's a great resource. And so if people are looking for a very quick and easy to understand primer, you should absolutely read it. I will pull out one thing I really like about it because it matches the same type of guidance that we give our journalists all the time, as well as, anyone that I'm talking to. Um, this is similar to the metaphor or simile question, but it's a little different. And it's covered in the primer too, which is we never personify algorithms or AI, right? So this is something we're very cognizant of at the Markup before ChatGPT or AI became a really popular phrase. We also don't personify algorithms. And the reason behind that is about accountability and agency, right? So if you say something like, the AI did this, right? Then it's suddenly like this nebulous machine as opposed to a human being used an AI to do something. And then you're like, oh, I know how to navigate that, right? And so something that we talk about a lot, and I was just browsing through the primer and I was like, oh, I found a very similar structure, is that we always talk about who is using AI to do what, right? And never the AI just does that, because that's not the full story. And so to give you an example, right, like college professors are using software that flags whether a student's work is AI generated, right? And then the rest of our story is that except, the software almost always flags anything an ESL student writes as AI generated because it can't tell the difference. But, in that world, you're suddenly like, oh, like I understand how this fits into my life, people like my loved ones' lives, society, and also I know who's using it, right? And like it comes in the form of software. It's not like a mysterious AI machine is accusing students of cheating, right? Though I will say we are guilty sometimes of putting stuff like that in our headlines to get people to understand that they should click and read the whole thing. But then we're very clear in the article exactly who is using it and how. But then also, what options do we have? I think agency from the public is really important. And we can talk more about that if you want as well. But just sort of this idea of being clear about exactly what's happening because it's important. And it's important because it helps people understand it's not something that's out of their control. And there is a who that we can hold accountable, whether it's a person, organization, government entity, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know you've done a lot of work in the space, and you often call attention to fantastic kind of labor organizers who are working in the space of interrogating and both leveraging and pushing back on technology. To the Markup's point, challenging technology to be better by us, basically. And I think a common refrain we hear is like, AI lays off whatever 5,000 workers, or AI is going to replace all these people. And it's like, it isn't the AI that is doing that, right? Like, someone at a company is making a decision to use a tool to decide who to lay off, for instance. But
Right.
by kind of personifying and placing so much energy and attention on the tool, we sometimes forget or frankly hide the fact that there are people involved in these decision-making processes. And it's not just the use of the tool, which certainly is one area where people are involved, but also there's so many people involved in building these technologies and choosing what they're going to prioritize and optimize for. So I think that guidance is really resonant for us. And I thank you for humoring me here and tooting our own horn. Really appreciate your expertise on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you, and we're going to pivot to some audience questions soon. So flagging for folks, the Q&A button is down at the bottom of your screen. Please do share your questions. In the meantime, I'd like to ask you, in the spirit of crowdsourcing, like our Q&A, I'd like to ask you, because across your career, you've used sort of crowdsourcing citizen science, from free the files to some of the more recent citizen science stuff, tracking internet speeds in different communities. How can actually the public help journalists? Not just journalists help the public, but what can all of us do to help journalists do a better job understanding, reporting on, delivering news about these topics?
Yeah, that's such a great question. There's so much the public can do. And I'll try to organize these into just sort of two buckets. One is you can offer your questions, right? So if you don't understand something, I think, this is something the journalism industry is moving and changing towards, which is really listening to readers and what their questions are and using that to shape the questions that we ask of those in power or that we try to collect data on because there isn't any. So if you have questions about stuff, you don't have to expect that, say, a reporter will literally write an article for you, but you shouldn't hesitate to actually bring it up with whatever news outlet covers your area or the topic that you're interested in. We get reader questions all the time that we just answer directly on social media. And it's always common stuff that other people would also want to know the answer to, right? So on the question front, I think just don't hesitate to reach out. I think it's sort of sometimes journalists can be sort of this unknown and you don't know how to interact with them if you've never interacted with a journalist before. And in the same way that they call you up and ask you questions, you can call them up and ask them questions. But then more broadly, right, I think that you can definitely offer sort of your tips. And tips is a word that's used in journalism very broadly to mean, like, if you have an idea for a story we should do, like, tell a journalist because something's happening in your community and no one's writing about it, right? But what I mean here is that I mentioned this earlier, right? In a lot of our journalism at the Markup, we discover the direct impact of a technology and the community knows the impact, but they don't know exactly how the technology is involved, right? And so if you feel like there's something suspicious or it feels kind of like at a scale that doesn't make sense, right? Basically, if you have that thought that's like something's wrong here, and I know one part of the puzzle, that's often enough information to help a journalist start digging into it and try to figure out what's going on. The other thing, and this is not even for how journalists can cover the topics, right? When we talk about how the public can get involved, and one of the things that we have seen is that when tech moves really fast, right, regulation has to play catch up. Um, and it just can't move as fast because, on the one hand, there are people who are dedicated to only thinking about this topic. And then on the other hand, there are regulators who have to think about all topics, right? So, um, something that we've been seeing is that even more than legislators, it's actually unions that are creating some of the first real and practical rules around how AI can and cannot be used by companies. And it's from their bargaining and labor contracts, right? They're saying at our company, this is what is really important to us. And so there's actually a lot of space right now for the public to participate in many different ways, whether it's about information, whether it's about what they're excited about, like should their kids be able to use it at school, right? You have a say in that. But then also, like, how do I want my company to be able to use this? Because again, it's not the AI that's going to take our jobs, right? It's the company deciding that AI should take your job. And but it also is the company deciding, like, let's all use AI to make our jobs easier, right? So there's a lot, if you think about it, a lot that as a member of the public or as a member of an organization, you can sort of interface with and advocate for things that you're interested in or ask for answers on questions that you have. And so I think, broadly speaking, I generally encourage people to engage with it. And then if you really want to help journalists get at the heart of these issues, definitely feel free to reach out to them. And you don't have to have the answer. I think that's the thing that I couldn't stress more. You don't have to say, I know exactly how all of this works, even if you know one piece of it, right? The journalist, it's their job to be able to dig into the rest.
So well said. And I actually, I'd love to, I know this isn't necessarily the type of coverage that the Markup does, but I would love, because you mentioned it, and actually one of our audience members asked a question. Um, the While it is true that government tends to move more slowly than some of the private industry, it is also the case that there's been a whole lot going on in government action
Yep.
and talk and decision making and proposals around these technologies. And one of our audience members asks, what is your advice for keeping up with this and understanding, what the state of policy is, in the US or globally as it relates to AI?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? It feels like things are moving at 100 miles per hour. And like, yeah, just reflecting what B just said, right? Like, regulators are paying a lot of attention and trying to move as fast as possible, as well as people who are not in government, who are in nonprofits, who are banding together internationally, even to try to like really set out some guidelines to help. And so this is one of those things where in any topic of news, it can easily feel overwhelming. And I think I have basically like a couple of practical recommendations, which is one, don't feel like you have to know the latest at all times. That's just throw that out the window. That's too much pressure about any topic to put on yourself. And as journalists, sort of, we experience that pressure a lot because when you cover something, you feel like you always have to be the first one to know it, even before another outlet covers it. So you're talking to the right people, etc. Just leave that to the side. What I would do is I would think about what kind of news have you consumed that you sort of like thought was really helpful, right? So like the article you read yesterday or the podcast you listened to. And what I would do is try to find like one, go beyond one, but go to like one, two, three sources, let's say, and subscribe to their newsletter or something like that. And then just like if your goal is to be up to date, to just read what is interesting to you that is sent to you in those newsletters, right? So newsletters often create like a menu for you to choose from where there's tons of links and you can just read a sentence about each one. And they will do all the curation work for you about who that newsletter curator, whose work they think you could read today that's new, right? And I find that that is sometimes the most manageable way to really stay informed without feeling like, oh, I didn't read the thing that just came out. Because I guarantee you something big is going to be in every newsletter. Like that's no question. But there are certain elements, like if you really like a publication, just use their newsletter as a way to help you manage information overload.
Absolutely. Got to plug the Markup as a fantastic source of information to stay up with. And I'll be shameless here and plug our newsletter too. Check out the Aspen Digital newsletter. Thank you so much for that. Really, really detailed and specific answer, which is so appreciated. As we wrap up here, I want to bring one more audience question into the chat before we let you go, which is, folks shared a ton of resources here. There were tons of links shared earlier. Oh my goodness. We will be sharing those links in the follow-up from these conversations. But, in addition to all the resources and organizations and TikToks to watch, would love to hear from you. What do you wish was getting more attention? What's something that you're really fascinated by, that you're digging into, or a topic that you think, or a space where there's not technology being used, but you think that there ought to be? What's something that you think that you could shine a little more light on for us?
Ooh, so many juicy topics that I could bring up here. Okay, I'll pick one, but I think one of the most befuddling topics to cover, and has been for the longest time, is probably privacy, right? So when it comes to your privacy online, there's a ton of resources, tools, etc., right? How to make your email comms, texting, etc., everything private. But the hard thing about covering privacy is that it feels like a big brother moment where you're like, this could happen. It might be happening, but it's really hard to connect all the dots. That's like, as a result of not having privacy in a certain area, this is now the consequence, right? That last mile is extremely hard to figure out. And so generally, you have people who are concerned about privacy or not. And when it comes to technology, right, it often has to do with like, am I willing to use this technology, even though I know that there's some like unknown situation I'll be in because I'm giving up my personal information, right? And like, it just feels like this fog, right? Like people don't know how to really quantify it or like tangibly hold it in their hands. And what's interesting about AI and privacy, right, is that there are some really clear, tangible things, such as, if instead of AI, what we're talking about is large language models and ChatGPT, it is using all the information on the internet, including your information, right? Like artists have really tangible ways of thinking about it, which is if it's consuming their art and trying to learn how to do art from it, is it a derivative, all that stuff. And when it comes to data privacy, there are ways for people have written tools for you to be able to be like, is my website being used to train ChatGPT, right? And I think something that is not getting enough attention, though we're wrapping up our coverage of it a little bit as well, is that people have also been trying to figure out a way such that, like all things in privacy, could the development of AI and how much it uses your data be an opt-in situation? And do you have a way to opt out, right? And so there's actually companies and policies in development out there that's about like, if you don't want your information out there, how can you hide it essentially from people that you don't want to just take it for free without your consent? And that I think is something where I feel like it's one of those wicked problems, right? Where we all know that if we could just be omniscient and see everything about the issue, there would be so many revelatory things. But because it's hidden, the best we can do at the Markup, as journalists, as the public, is try to make as transparent as possible what we do know and try to like bring more stuff to light, because there's so much money moving around for your data. And something is always difficult when it's in this nebulous, foggy space as opposed to a tangible space.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is, I can't wait, Sisi, to have another chat with you, because this is a topic I'm very passionate about, a topic I know our team is very passionate about, and really grateful to everyone who submitted in the audience Q&A to bring us these great questions for Sisi Wei. Sisi, what a joy. So much knowledge, so much wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us. As we transition here, we're going to have a special announcement. So I'm very excited for what's next, but I just want to invite everyone to give a big hand to Sisi and to all of our panelists for making this conversation possible. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.